Hi everyone, my name is Gwenda and I'm currently a master's student at Durham University. I'm very happy today to be here presenting my paper on the significance of touch in two of D.H. Lawrence's short stories, The Blind Man and the Ladybird. We will be looking into his theory of blood consciousness that's been outlined in Fantasia of the Unconscious and how blood consciousness affects connection between his characters. I would like to start off with a quote from Lawrence himself. So long as men are dominated by their own isolation, their own absoluteness, which after all is but a picture of an idea, nothing is possible but insanity more or less pronounced. Men must get back into touch. Lawrence, as a war writer, is concerned with the mechanized human after the First World War, which is the context of the quote. He finds it very important to recreate connections between people as a healing process, because the war makes humans isolated and alienated. Referring to the post-war world humans as walking dead, he is keen to revive a sense of life in human beings. In Lawrence's theory, as the sense of aliveness lies in blood consciousness, to reignite it, men must get back into touch, because it reawakens hidden passion and emotions. We'll be looking at two short stories, The Blind Man and the Ladybird, which were both written in early 20th century. They both concern with how the war has affected an individual and how the human hand is described as an agent of sensory knowledge. Lawrence in these two stories shows how the hands have the power to unlock unconscious motivations and desires in human beings. It can also reveal the truth of the soul as well as reconnecting humans and is capable of restoring life. Why is such an important sense? Touch, being the very first and earliest sense that is developed in the human embryo, is the sense through which human experience and form subjectivity. By touching objects or other human beings, we realize our own separateness and alienation from the external world. We are made aware of our body. Hence, the sense of touch forms our self consciousness. We are conscious of our body as both an organ of perception, a body that touches, and as the object of perception, a body that is touched. This double consciousness establishes the physical border between us and this external world, allowing us to develop a sense of self through recognizing our bodily boundaries in relation to others. Touch also makes emotional bonds possible. By evoking affective response in us when we come into contact with others, touch creates a sentient border, one which shapes our social relationships. We are able to form and express connections by engaging in tactile communication with others. For Lawrence, this strong awareness of self-consciousness heightened by the sense of touch is the blood consciousness. He divides the human consciousness into two opposing realms of blood and mental. He believes that the core of our being lies in the blood consciousness, which he defines as a mode of perception where one lives, knows, and has one's being in the blood without any reference to nerves and brain. To be connected to one's blood consciousness, therefore, connotes the ability to achieve the fullness of one's being and soul, the central God of the human body. It is necessary connection for men to be men and to feel alive. Human touch is thus vital in igniting one's blood consciousness. Not only does touch constitute our sense of reality by forming our conception of what exists outside of us, but it also offers an inner central perception of our body when it is experienced as an emotion. In contrast to the sense of sight, which Lawrence considers as the least essential of all the senses, touch triggers a dynamic psychic current that flows in the blood. It intensifies the awareness of our inner existence in relation to the wider external world. Touch is the gateway to blood consciousness. It is the sense through which we are made to connect with the inner essence of ourselves. As mentioned, Lawrence is greatly concerned with the mechanized men as a result of the war. He wrote in an article in the Manchester Guardian that all that remains in human is a cold metallic adherence to an iron machine, shed of flesh and blood, soul, and intelligence. Human failure to connect with their blood consciousness has left them hollow and isolated. To move on in life after the horrific monstrosity of war, men must recognize the importance of revitalizing their broken and devastated souls. They must be reminded of their essence of being. For Lawrence, it is precisely touch that can help people in regaining their humanity and their capacity to be aware of their own individuality. The first story we will look at is The Blind Man, written in 1922 and was published in the short story collection England My England. It explores the fears and feelings of the protagonist, Morris, who is a man blinded and disfigured in the First World War. He has returned home from the war, but life is very different with his loss of sight. We will be looking into two main scenes in the story that heighten how his sense of touch through his hand is an emotional experience. The first scene focuses on Morris's perception of his surrounding. Lawrence draws our attention to Morris's hand by infusing it with life. With a delicate tactile discernment and warm-looking fingers, his reddish and ruddy hands suggest the healthy flow of blood in his skin, implying a sense of life. They are also intelligent with strong prominent veins in the wrists, revealing their power in acquiring knowledge that is necessary for Morris to construct his new life. Lawrence is proposing that Morris is able to activate his blood consciousness through his hands, and hence he could experience life as it is. Let's look at a close reading passage from the short story. Pervin, as the last name of Morris, moved about almost unconsciously in his familiar surroundings, dark though everything was. He seemed to know the presence of objects before he touched them. It was a pleasure to him to walk thus through a world of things, carried on the flood in a sort of blood prescience. He did not think much or trouble much. So long as he kept this sheer immediacy of blood contact with the substantial world, he was happy. He wanted no intervention of visual consciousness. In this state, there was a certain rich positivity, bordering sometimes on rapture. Life seemed to move in him like a tide lapping and advancing, enveloping all things darkly. It was a pleasure to stretch forth the hand and meet the unseen object, clasp it, and possess it in pure contact. He did not try to remember, to visualize. He did not want to. The new way of consciousness substituted itself in him. In fact, Lawrence believes that the human hand possesses its own consciousness. In his famous essay, Why the Novel Matters, he claims that the human hand learns a vast number of things and knows a vast number of things. This knowledge that the hand could acquire suggests that it has a power and life of its own. It could respond directly to a real essence of being, which Lawrence further recognizes and states that since my hand is alive, me alive. Back to the close reading. Similarly, Morris's life has been enriched by his engaging hand. He is experiencing the world with a new way of consciousness, which is of being in blood contact and moving through the world with a blood prescience. His hand acts as a learning tool that gives him a sense of realness. Indeed, he finds pleasure and positivity by touching and feeling rather than seeing or visualizing reality. The fact that he does not think much suggests that instead of engaging mainly with his mental consciousness, his chosen mode of perception is through his blood. Regardless of his blindness, Morris's connection with his inner essence of being allows him to lead a fulfilling life because he is able to know the world as it is. He can come into pure contact with his surrounding and enjoy the peace of immediate contact with life. Morris's grounding presence further heightens the sense of restoration of life in him. He walks with heavy limbs and powerful legs that seemed to know the earth, showing his strong sense of certainty and determination that accompanies his knowledge of reality. The emphasis on Morris's heaviness in the lower part of his body symbolizes the weight of truth of life that his hands have come to explore, which is his aliveness. Lawrence then moves on in the narrative to show how the human hand could reconnect people and rebuild a bond that is particularly vital for the mechanized men from the war. Tactile contact between men during the war is profound, for it brings intimacy and intensity to human relationships, which otherwise might have broken down due to the drastic circumstances of alienation, death, mutilation, and bombardment from the war. The second scene we will be looking at is one with Morris getting to know another character Berti through the sense of touch. As Morris is blind, he can't see Berti but wishes to know Berti. And since the only way Morris could gain knowledge of the world is through the sense of touch, he reaches out his hand to touch Bertie's head and body. Well, for Morris, this encounter is exhilarating because he feels that he has successfully formed a union with Bertie. It leaves Bertie extremely uncomfortable. Morris's enthusiasm can be explained by Lawrence's concept of a Blutbruderschaft, a German word which translates to blood brotherhood. As Morris is connected with his blood consciousness, he hopes to form an intimate friendship with Bertie which resembles the comradeship between men in war. When Morris takes Bertie's hand and presses it against his own disfigured eye sockets and lets it run along his scar, Morris is seeking to let Bertie see the real him by exposing his own vulnerability. Lawrence wants to convey the idea that the human hand could indeed uncover the truth of one's soul and lays it bare without any disguise. On the other hand, when Bertie is touched by Morris, he feels annihilated, like a mollusk without its shell. It is evident that the tactile tenderness between the two men strips them naked, but their respective response to the intimacy forms a stark contrast. While Morris feels a curious elation and that they shall know each other now, with their new delicate fulfillment of mortal friendship, Bertie feels invaded, violated, and imprisoned from an intimacy that has been thrust upon him. In this failed Blutbruderschaft, Lawrence shows how hands can build blood relationship that depends upon a tactile transmission into one's blood consciousness, as opposed to forming a percept in Morris. Yet in Bertie, they stir extreme discomfort by unveiling the truth of his soul. Bertie, who fails to form romantic relationship with women, is described as feeling neutral and nothing in his core. It is precisely this fear of exposing his emptiness that greatly distresses him as Morris explores him with his hands, the hands that are capable of learning and knowing Bertie's own true, weak self. The next story that we'll look at is the Ladybird. How a human hand could unlock one's blood consciousness by conveying hidden wishes and desires. Like The Blind Man, the Ladybird is a war story that focuses on the protagonist of the Ladybird. The Count is badly wounded from the war. While recovering at the hospital, he is visited by Daphne and the two start developing feelings for each other. We will again look at two scenes in the story. The first focuses on the Count's hands. In contrast to Morris's hands, which were full of life, the Count's hands are described as thin and short. They hurt him and cause him pain. Unlike Morris, the Count's soul is utterly destroyed and shattered by the war. It is left with loose, palpitating humanity. He is filled with anger and bitterness and sees death as a solution. Evidently, he has lost his soul, or in Lawrence's term, he has lost his connection with his own blood consciousness in the war. The Count says to Daphne that the war seems to have driven my soul out of me like a bird frightened away at last, implying a lack of vitality in him. As if having a mind and life of their own, his hands pick up on his desolation. They hurt, and though the Count admits that he does not know the reason for the pain, his hands tell him that he needs Daphne's hair around them, suggesting that they know what he needs. They yearn for a comfort from the other person's soul. They are sending a signal to the Count, indicating how his emptiness causes pain. His hands feel the need to grab hold of something in order to feel real. By asking to feel the weight of Daphne's hair, which is described as heavy with hermetic gold and so much water, the Count's hands express their desire for the weight of a soul. They yearn to possess a heaviness like Morris's to feel grounded in order to fill the void in the Count himself. In the same story, but through the character of Daphne, Lawrence draws our attention to the hand's capacity to expose suppressed sexual desires. We will be looking at a scene where Daphne is alone at home and she sits sewing with a thimble that's given to her by the Count. As a married woman, Daphne feels guilty and tries to deny her strong sexual attraction towards the Count. While she sits sewing, she attempts to reignite the passion she had for her husband, hoping to cast the count out of her mind. Yet at the same time, her hands are toying with the thimble. Daphne is repeatedly inserting and removing her finger in and out of the cap of the thimble, which bears a strong resemblance to a woman's genitals. Her hands, striving hard to make Daphne aware of her own true sentiments, have betrayed and refused to obey her mental consciousness. Indeed, the human hand communicates far more truth than we think. In Montague's book on Touch, the human significance of the skin, we learn that fingertips have extraordinary sensitive nerve excitability. They are found to be especially erogenous and sexually arousing. Hence, Daphne is unconsciously engaging in what Sigmund Freud terms as symptomatic action, which are defined as actions that are performed automatically, unconsciously, without noticing, but can express unconscious thought and impulses. With her hands, Daphne is actively seeking a substitute for masturbatory gratification. Although consciously forcing herself to recall the love she had for her husband, her sexual desires are evidently directed towards the Count. Not only is she deliberately using the Count's thimble, but when she stares at the engraved Ladybird, which is the Count's family crest, she chants unconsciously to herself, the Ladybird, as if hypnotized by its sexual connotations. Daphne's hands, evoking her wish to trace and touch, clearly yearn for sensuality with the Count. She further experiences pleasure from the heavy weighted sensation of the thimble on her finger. Like the Count's desire to feel the weight of her hair on his hands, Daphne too yearns for the weight of a connection with him, one that would allow her true soul to surface, bringing meaning back to a post-war world filled with emptiness and bleakness. To conclude, let's look at this quote from D.H. Lawrence's essay, Why the Novel Matters. To be alive, to be man alive, to be whole man alive, that is the point. With a strong intention to bring aliveness back to the world, Lawrence looks to the sense of touch in men. Devoid of language and cognition, touch is indeed our very first way of knowing the world. It presents the truth of the world in all its bareness through the sensory agent of the human hand. The world we know is the one we touch, which in turn touches us in immediate tactile contact. In showing the power of the human hand, Lawrence suggests that it possesses a life of its own, one that connects directly to our blood consciousness. In fact, it is immortal and could transcend death because it represents our inner essence, the truth of our soul, which is not confined by bodily boundaries. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, further expresses that if one's lips are silent, one will be vulnerable with one's fingertips. Betrayal seeps through the pore. In communicating veracity, the human hand is capable of reawakening a sense of life that goes beyond the reality as perceived by the mental consciousness. It has the potential to restore the broken human soul by filling its void with the weight of life. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your patience and attention. Feel free to drop me an email if you have any questions regarding my paper. Thank you and hope you all have a great day.